Nigeria has one of the lowest revenue to GDP ratios in the world, making its fiscal position vulnerable to shocks. In 2021, the country's general government revenue was just about 7.3% of GDP, which is less than half of the average among ECOWAS member countries and around a third of the average of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. For Africa's largest economy, increasing its revenues and, of course, shoring up its fiscal position must be top priorities of the incoming administration. In 2022, Nigeria found itself with debt servicing overtaking revenue, while unemployment is estimated to have increased to 37.7% last year and will rise to about 40.6% this year. Africa's largest crude oil producer has also struggled to meet its crude production quota, affecting an important part of its revenue base. If Nigeria intends to achieve macroeconomic stability, it must take a bold step to put in place decisive fiscal and monetary policies. And that starts with taxes. Collins Nweke, Global Affairs Analyst, joins me now to take a look at reforming Nigeria's tax system and what it means for its economy and its people. Collins, welcome to Business Edge again. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Tolu, for having me. Cheers.
So when we look at the fact that this is Africa's largest economy, but we put ourselves side by side the performance of other economies on the continent in terms of taxation, Nigeria is not really in a good place. We're ranked 191 out of 193 countries, and there's just a number of issues. So let's start with the issues. What is bedeviling Nigeria's tax system?
Well, there is this cliche, Tolu, that if citizens won't be caught, they will not pay taxes. I mean, it's not a cliche that is, true of just Nigeria or Africa, but, globally around the world. Now, I think the main issue bedeviling Nigeria's, tax system is the fact that it is very, very weak, completely lax. Now, what you get is a situation where only direct tax, are mainly applied. I mean, that is, workers who are paid monthly salary, their taxes are taken off their pay before it gets to their bank account. Now, that is grossly insufficient to raise the resources that government needs to actually, run the economy. So that is one obvious way that, Nigeria, has done very poorly. Now, you also look at the fact that those who ought to pay, who have the capacity to pay, businesses and so on and so forth, actually evade taxes or avoid them entirely. So that also is an issue that is bedeviling the Nigerian economy. And then, of course, so far, we have very, very low taxation in Nigeria. Now, I'm not saying that in itself is a serious problem. If the tax rate is low, but the base is broad enough, and more people are more, honest about paying their taxes, and government puts some, compliance measure in place, I do not think that the low taxes rate is a big issue, because when the base is broad enough, more will be captured and more revenue will go into the government coffer. So those are just, a paintbrush of, the issues bedeviling the Nigerian tax system.
So when we look at this IMF data, Nigeria has the potential to further increase its tax revenue, but tax capacity is also estimated to be about between 8 to 11% of GDP, while the country is currently doing about 4.5% as of 2021. So there's space for growth, which is estimated at 12.5 to 13%. So the implication is that there is a wide tax gap that needs to be filled. And you've talked about some of the reasons why that gap exists. But I think it's also important that we hammer on what that gap means. So in terms of the fact that Nigeria has low tax mobilization, what's the impact on the economy? What's the impact on delivering services for the people of Nigeria?
Well, the first obvious impact, Tolu, is the fact that you have high, very, very humongously high, unemployment rate. And that is because, businesses are not growing. And when they are not growing, they are not simply hiring. So that also translates, because it has a sort of a snowball effect. Because if more people are not in employment, then even the assured tax income source, which is the direct tax that they deduct from people's salary, is in jeopardy. So that's number one. And then number two is the fact that, there are just too many loopholes. And based on, the IMF report that you cited, it was actually projected that if Nigeria is able to raise its, tax rate, say by 2027 up to about 15%, they will have, more resources to finance the economy. And then, of course, you can also see the level of borrowing that Nigeria does. Now, we actually borrow in Nigeria to be able to even finance the federal budget. So that in itself is a very clear signal that not enough resources are being generated through taxation and other means, of course, to be able to, do what government ought to do, to keep the country going.
Okay, so the IMF is making some recommendations that I know are going to raise some dust. So let's look at those recommendations in terms of what the International Monetary Fund says Nigeria should do when it comes to its tax reforms. One of the things that will be most contentious is Nigeria adopting the VAT rate, that's value-added tax, comparable to Nigeria's peer ECOWAS country average, around 15%. This means further increasing VAT rates from the current 7.5% to 10% by 2023 and then to 15% by 2027. We also see a situation where millions more Nigerians have crossed the poverty line since COVID-19. Small and medium businesses, as you've mentioned, are struggling under a fragmented foreign exchange regime. And there's even continued electricity challenges. And if the small businesses are struggling, as you said, they're not employing. You're not widening the net for more people to pay taxes. Is there a middle ground here? And I think the bigger question is, Collins, do you think Nigerians can afford to pay more in VATs, which ends up being spread across every Nigerian because it's added along the chain? It's added at the point of purchase.
Yeah, well, I think in answering that question, what Nigeria needs to look at is the ability to pay, principal, because essentially the essence of taxation isn't to strangulate, the workers. No, certainly not even the businesses, because, you also have to understand that if you have an obnoxious tax regime, it stifles businesses, growth is not there, the economy is not, actually doing as it ought to be doing. And when you look at the recommendations put forth by the IMF, it is not very much different from, to a large extent, Nigeria has captured it in its, strategic revenue growth initiative, the so-called SRGI, where they talked also about raising the revenue to GDP ratio to 15%, but as opposed to IMF, Nigeria had projected that this can happen in 2025. Nigeria also is looking at expanding its base. Now, the issue with that base expansion is that, in principle, is fantastic, because when more people are paying, like I alluded to earlier, I mean, even if the tax rate remains as low as it is, when more people carry the burden, then more money will get into the coffer. But there is this issue of, trust deficit. But also, those who actually claim that, the petty traders are not paying taxes, they are making a very huge mistake, because the government has actually looked away while, touts actually go to harass these, petty traders, collecting taxes from them that go into individual pockets, the so-called rents that they pay.
Yes.
So it needs to plug some of those, holes so that the money will begin to be streamlined. And that is where, bringing in automation comes in, and is part of the recommendation made by IMF as well.
It's interesting you mentioned, of course, the tout situation, like somewhere here in Lagos, where there's a very large informal economy that operates in the city, operates in the states, many people have pointed to the fact that, in fact, people at the poorer end of the spectrum sometimes end up paying more taxes than many people at the higher end because of this informal situation where you have non-state actors operating in such a way where that money is collected, but it doesn't make it into government coffers. So when we look at that kind of situation, it also means, as you said, automating and bringing in the informal sector into the taxation situation. There's also the generous VAT exemptions, Collins, and Nigeria is very, very generous with that. So let's move to that point now. So the IMF also recommended that these VAT extensions be streamlined to be a better targeted way that focuses more on basic items consisting of a larger share of the poor's consumption basket. Then there's also the excise rates and broadening the tax base, which are seen as more inelastic than other taxation sources. So this recommendation is that there should be a gradual increase in excise rates. So what are some of the items Nigeria is currently exempting, and what impact would raising the excise rates also have?
Well, there have been a number of suggestions. I will concentrate on maybe one or two of them because, in other climes, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have seen where, reforms were made in that direction and, they actually yielded results. And that is increasing the rate for alcohol and tobacco. That is considered, a luxury item, but the list is actually large. The list of luxury items that Nigeria currently, institute some sort of exemptions that ought not to be. Now, I have not actually underwritten in total the recommendations of the IMF, but I believe that one area that they made very good sense, in my opinion, is the fact that, yes, an exemption in, goods and services that actually affect the everyday man, those on the, below the poverty line, that those ones are very, very important. Now, you will wonder why, for instance, in South Africa, everybody, including those that are financially could be considered as poor, they look healthy, well-fed, and all of that. That is because government actually ensures deliberately that taxes on food items are, kept as low as possible, so that the nation is very well-fed. So, if tax exemptions in such an area is instituted, I think Nigeria will actually, experience very, very astronomical growth, especially now that oil revenue is seriously dwindling and the emphasis is now on agriculture and other, non-oil products. This is the time indeed to review that exemption package to ensure that it goes to the right places.
All right, so I want to stay on that a bit more because when we look at this broadening of the tax base, you've talked about the fact that there's a lot of evasion, tax evasion that happens within the country. And even this multi-layered, multiple taxation that we experience. What about the complicity of government agencies, whether at the local level, the state level, or even the federal level, that simply do not do what they're meant to do when it comes to taxation and reforms? And we've seen reforms in recent times. The Finance Act 2020 that President Muhammadu Buhari signed is also one of those things that gave us some bit of reform.
Well, yeah. Essentially, you will note that tax evasion, of course, is a major issue, and many people in a situation where they believe that their taxes will be used for the right purposes, I think many people will, maybe grudgingly, but certainly will pay, especially when the revenue that accrue from those taxes are plowed back in the system so that their, business environment is, improved and enhanced. But that is actually not the case in Nigeria. In other climes, for instance, out here where I live and work, each year when you receive invitation to complete your tax returns, you get a clear overview of the taxes paid the previous year, where they were spent on, and the projections for the year for which you are now being requested to pay your taxes, where the taxes you pay will go into. So I think such transparency is a very, very good thing. And in the case of Nigeria, take, for instance, a situation where tax break is, given to people and, they borrow. Now, what then happens is that in certain situations, there is a cut in also public spending. For instance, the payment of the salaries of parliamentarians are cut down along the line of tax cuts that were made. In Nigeria, it is essentially the opposite, where they go home, the politicians, the public officials go home with humongous salaries that cannot in any way be justified. So those are the sort of things that create the mistrust that Nigeria has to address if they are serious about expanding the tax base and getting people enthusiastic about paying their fair share of the taxes.
All right, so Collins, we're having this conversation at the tail end of the Buhari administration. And Nigeria has been discussing tax reforms for many years. And as I mentioned earlier, of course, there were some changes under the Finance Act, which was signed by President Muhammadu Buhari for 2020. But that just didn't go far enough. And now we have the administration of President-elect Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who's going to be under a lot of pressure because of the country's fiscal position. So instituting more tax reforms will fall squarely on his desk. So if you look at Tinubu's antecedents in Lagos State, the commercial capital of Nigeria, said that if it was a country, it would be probably one of the 5th or the 6th, I think one of the top 10 economies here on the African continent. When we look at Tinubu's antecedents as governor in Lagos in terms of reform and taxation, what direction do you think the incoming president might take on the issue of taxation?
Well, we have seen, based on the period that you have mentioned, that one of the cardinal points of, their taxation, what you can now begin to look at as Tinubunomics is, the expansion of tax base. Now, one can only expect, if you also look at the manifesto of APC going into this election, it gives you some semblance of what actually he's going to do if he becomes president of, or when he becomes president of Nigeria. Now, expansion of the tax base is going to be one of it. And I believe that he was also very robust on automation, making sure that the loopholes are plugged. But one will also expect that, like he did in Lagos, those who are able to pay, the businesses, that they are made to pay. Let's hope that, when we hear the shout of the last man standing, that is not the beginning of, a deal to ensure that those, multinationals that have the money, the Dangotes, the $10 and the rest of them, the Elumelus, that they are going to be, just be given the free ride. But it doesn't look like that is going to be the case. One will hope that a few of them will stand out, just like Warren Buffett stood out in the United States once and told Donald Trump that the tax break that he is giving to him, he didn't ask for it, and he doesn't need it. I hope more Nigerians will rise up to that occasion. More Nigerians that have the capacity to pay, that they should pay the right way and find it as, the role of good citizens.
All right, Collins, before I let you go, you've mentioned one or two things I want to wrap up this conversation with. And we see that taxation is also very much a political conversation. It's something that people campaign on, they can win elections on, and they can lose elections on. But there are issues of corruption that make it difficult for the Nigerian public to trust the government. You've talked about transparency before. When it comes to this lack of trust, this sort of breakdown in confidence and trust between the government and the people, it affects tax morale and, of course, tax compliance. How does Nigeria get over that hill in the next few years if we're to meet these recommendations and, of course, some of these targets?
I believe that the first thing that needs to be done is for the public officials to generate goodwill. one of the ways that they could do that is a thorough review downwards of the humongous pay of public officials. President-elect Tinubu is actually one of such offenders. If you consider the sort of pension package that he has, that is criminal. And a whole lot of governors across the country are following suit. They need to immediately jettison that, and that will send a very strong message to Nigerians that, yes, we can begin to trust these people. As long as they continue to cut away such humongous, unjustified, pays and benefits, it will be very difficult to convince Nigerians that they mean well and that this is not all about them. So that is one way to start. And then, of course, automation, I continue to emphasize, is very, very important. We've seen the 4 African countries, that you referred to, which was contained in the IMF report that could be considered as good examples. These are countries that actually run a very good automation system and, simplified the tax collection, process so that businesses especially pay what they ought to pay and in good time.
All right, Collins and Nweke, we'll leave the conversation at that. It's one that definitely is going to receive more attention in the coming days and weeks as we see a new administration, and also the coming years with Africa's largest economy continuing this revenue struggle that we've seen. But it's one that will be an interesting one in the coming years. Thank you so much for your time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Tolu.
And as Collins said, the IMF has asked Nigeria to look at lessons from 4 other sub-Saharan African countries, including Rwanda, Mauritania, the Gambia, and Uganda, that did a few things collectively, apparently, to successfully drive tax reforms. And that, of course, included focusing on indirect tax, which was VAT and excise reforms, reduction of tax exemptions as well, and also focusing on compliance with segmentation and automation. Does Nigeria have the political will to push through taxation reform? And does Nigeria, or rather at this point, do Nigerians even have the trust in the system and the government to be much more compliant and pay their taxes as and when due so that they can see the benefits of those taxes in the society? It's a conversation that's going to continue for some time. But the conversations also continue right here on Business Edge. And up next is the International Business Headlines. Stay with us.